Hey folks, welcome back. Welcome back because maybe you were here last week when we started our series on the pelvic floor and working with that pelvic floor opening, how it connects with the hip joint. And we're going to continue looking at that. So we started this series last week, if you want to check out last week's. And then we're going to continue a little bit with how the pelvic floor can affect forward bending, and a lot how it can affect your hamstring muscles, maybe a little bit your lower back muscles. So a lot of times we're all talking about how our hamstrings are tight. Maybe you're talking about how your lower back is tight. Maybe you have a hard time sitting up straight when you're on the floor. And we often say, kind of attribute that to the hips as a whole or to the hamstrings as a whole. But the pelvic floor is a part of it too. It works in conjunction with the hamstrings. So I have a little skeleton here again, which we looked at last week for the pelvic floor. And I'll just point out a couple key things about that. Tailbone. So the sacrum is this bone in the pelvis a little bit higher up. And the tailbone is 2 or 3 bones, the coccyx bone, down at the very base of the sacrum. So the tailbone right here and the sacrum here. And then the sitting bones here at the bottom of the pelvis. So if you look at the pelvis here, the pelvic bones here, down at the bottom are the sitting bones. I have them turned around here so you can see that there. And then this whole area of musculature in between, that is your pelvic floor muscles. When we talk about the pelvic floor, we're talking about muscles inside the pelvis, inside that structure. So tailbone, sits bone, sits bone. We're going to go back to those areas on your body today. And then the hamstring, we know where the hamstrings are generally, right? We feel their tightness, but typically we feel their tightness like in the middle of the muscle. They start on the sits bones right up here, right? All three, it's 3 muscles, the hamstring muscles, the hamstrings. And then they go down, crossing the hip joint. And then they cross the second joint, they cross your knee joint and attach way down low at this sort of back of the shin bone, the tibia bone, the back of the tibia through here. So the hamstring can affect down by the knee, and it can affect up by the hip. And so today, when we're looking at how the pelvic floor relates, it's a little more about how the hamstring can pull on the hip. So that long muscle, those long muscles, as they pull a little tighter, they can pull your pelvis, right? They can pull on the sits bone. Sometimes as the pelvis moves, right, it's kind of the opposite. The pelvis moves and that pulls on the hamstring muscle. And it feels tight all the time, even though it might not be tight. Sometimes that's the case for people. The hamstring isn't super tight, but it feels tight because of the way the pelvis is pulling. And then, as I showed a minute ago, it can also pull the other way and create some tightness through here. So you may even be able to see, like as I tip the pelvis a little bit back and forth, do you see how the sits bones get closer to the tailbone? And then as I tip it the other way, you see how the sits bones get farther from the tailbone. And that's the pelvic floor. So the pelvic floor is all these muscles in here, right? So if the pelvic floor is really tight, that's one layer. And then the hamstring is really tight, that's another layer. We can feel like all this tightness right around here. And then if I try to forward bend with all this tension kind of pulling through here, you can imagine it's going to be hard to bend forward and do some sort of stretch. A lot of times what we feel is a lot of tightness in the hamstrings, but that's not the only tightness there. So that's kind of a little bit what we're going to look at today and work with today. So I'm going to get rid of the skeleton and we can set up on your mat. So first thing to do, I think, is to kind of feel those bones for yourself. The sits bone especially, I think a lot of us can feel. If you lean a little forward, sometimes you can find it. There might be a little bit of flesh down here. There might be a lot of flesh down here. It varies for all of us. I happened to inherit a sort of buttless physique, so there's not a lot of flesh for me. But if you kind of pull on that flesh a little bit, you can usually find that bony sits bone feeling there on either side. And as you sit, Maybe you can feel that in the floor. And then the tailbone is kind of personal, right? It goes down pretty low to get to your tailbone. So your sacrum, right in the middle of your pelvis, and then you'd actually drop down pretty low to find the tailbone. It hangs down pretty low. And you may notice on the skeleton, it curls under a little naturally. Sometimes we talk about tucking your tailbone and that's not so great. That's different than just the natural curl of the tailbone. It kind of just like comes in a little bit on its own without creating any tightness there. So that's pretty low down there. Maybe you can find that too. And then come onto your back once you have a sense of where those bony landmarks are. So another thing we talked about last week a fair amount was visualizing sensation or the area of the pelvic floor, as opposed to really trying to feel it. So if I think like, oh, tighten all the pelvic floor muscles, I can do that. But even as I showed that example, I felt my neck even tighten. Usually what happens if I try to tighten the pelvic floor is I get a lot of other extra muscles coming on, because it's very difficult to feel the pelvic floor because it's an involuntary muscle. So a lot of times those muscles don't have a lot of sensation. So I'm just going to imagine that area of muscles in the pelvic floor. And then specifically, because we're talking about hamstrings today, I'm going to think about relaxing around my sits bones. And you might think like, I can't relax a bone. So my answer to that is why not? Maybe you can. And if that works for you, just think about relaxing the bone. It's a nice image. It works for a lot of people to just actually visualize the bone relaxing a little bit, the bone settling a little bit. But for some people, that image is like a little too abstract. So then you could think about, in thinking about relaxing the bone, what you're actually doing is thinking about relaxing all the muscles that attach to that bone. And there actually are a lot. One of which is the hamstring, and others are pelvic floor muscles that are in that area. So it's a little easier sometimes to just think, I'm going to relax around my sits bones, than to try and learn all the anatomy of musculature around there. So either way, take a couple breaths and think of relaxing around your sits bones. And then we're going to apply that same technique to your tailbone. Think about where your tailbone is and imagine relaxing your tailbone, and or imagine relaxing all the soft tissue around your tailbone. And either way, that allows the tailbone to be a little heavier. I'm not moving, I'm not tipping my pelvis back and forth. I'm just thinking of my tailbone being heavier, letting it drop a little. And then maybe you can start to imagine the space of the pelvic floor. All the soft tissue between sits bone, tailbone. And we could add in pubic bone as well in the front. Relaxing all that area, maybe breathing a little bit into that area. And then we're going to try a tricky little experiment, which is to think about tightening in your lower abdominals without letting the sits bones and the tailbone turn on and all those muscles turn on. So there's a couple ways that could express. I could tighten my abdominals, and it's possible in that moment I would tip my whole pelvis and like squeeze in my butt. That would definitely be a sign that my pelvic floor has come on and my hamstrings have come on. But probably you're a little more subtle and nuanced than that. So then it's a little trickier. I have to feel all that openness and release in the sits bone and tailbone, and that image of the pelvic floor being really soft. And then notice as you exhale, as you let the abdominals come on a little bit, is there a little bit of like tensing up down in your glutes or down in your tailbone, maybe around your hip flexors? That's kind of the nuance we're looking at. Can you exhale, find a little abdominal work, but only enough that you don't also grab down around the sits bones? What's that like for you? Maybe you want to put your hands down there. Sometimes that's helpful. Maybe you're just visualizing it. Like I said, it's pretty hard to feel. And you might think, well, I'm barely using my abdominals. I'm not even sure I'm using them. So maybe put your hands on your abdominals. Sometimes people tell me they're not using their abdominals, but then if they put their hands there, it's actually like tight. It's just hard to feel from internally that they're using it. So you might check out like, oh, they're actually on. Just isn't a lot of sensation there. And once you think you have a sense of that, play with some knee folds. So the right leg floating in and exhale back down. And then the left leg floating in and back down. So it's a lot to track. So the abdominals coming on. And as the leg floats in, just that nice, soft, relaxed sits bone. Lowering down. Abdominals come on, the left leg comes in. As it comes in, the sits bone heavy, muscles around the sits bone relaxing. Back down. Play with that idea a few more times. Maybe you notice the tailbone as well. Thinking of the tailbone just dropping onto the floor. One more each side. And then relax everything down for a couple breaths. And just let everything settle. Okay, so we're going to play a little bit with that idea with the hamstrings. So if you recall, I said the sits bone is the beginning of the hamstring. Hamstring originates there, and then it goes all the way down to below the knee. That's where they insert there. So if my hamstring is tight, sometimes I get to about here, and as I straighten my leg more and more, my sits bone gets higher and higher, right? Because it just doesn't let go. That hamstring sometimes will pull all the way into the sits bone. So then I might think, okay, well, I want to leave my sits bones relaxed, right? I'm going to let my pelvic floor stay relaxed. And then as my leg starts to straighten, I hit that tightness. So then sometimes what happens is the leg goes down, right? And so still that tightness in the upper part kept my leg from really getting as straight as it could, my hamstring from really lengthening that way. It's very tricky because the hamstring crosses two joints. So it's an interesting experiment to think about the sits bone relaxing, the tailbone relaxing, starting with the knee pretty bent, and going to just the spot where you feel the first tug of hamstring pull. Not that hard tug where it's really, really tight or really gets a lot of stretch in it. Just that first sign of resistance. Where's that place? And then take a moment, just like we did with the other exercises, with the other visualization. See if you can, little by little, maybe go a little straighter and think of length and ease and release along the back of the leg, down to the sits bone, down to the tailbone. My leg didn't get all the way straight. It's fine if yours doesn't. And then bend everything back down and relax it. Trying that same thing again. Now I'm holding a little bit with this other hand. You can do that if you want, or you could just think, I'm going to use my abdominals to do this. A little bit of tug, that's where my first tug shows up, not really very straight. And then just a little more without dropping your leg down towards the floor, without lifting your pelvis up. And just nice, long, easy release. And then take it back down. Doesn't feel like a huge stretch. It's okay. We'll check it out in a minute, see if we've gotten anywhere with it. But for now, we just that nice image. One more time. And hold it up here this time, either with your hands holding your leg or without your hands holding your leg. If you're getting a lot in the front of your hip, then maybe you've gone a little too far and the hamstring isn't really letting go. If you're getting a little in the front of your hip, probably not a big deal. And then take it down. And take both legs down straight on the floor, and let's do a little inventory. How does it feel after doing that? Right leg compared to left leg. Now, I'll give you a little bit of my experience, just so you can compare that as well. My right leg feels like it's actually a little heavier in the floor. It's like the floor is almost a little uneven, and that right leg's dropping a little heavier. It kind of feels a little longer. It feels like it maybe rotates out a little bit more. And that whole side of the pelvis feels a little heavier. And a lot of people report those things. So maybe you notice a difference in that way too, maybe not. But it's interesting, right? If you do notice that, especially, didn't seem like you were doing a big stretch. And yet, often it feels a lot more released after doing that little deep release through the pelvic floor and through the very beginnings of the hamstring tightness. So let's see what the other leg's like. Bending your knees. If you want, you can reach your hands around to your sits bone, whatever feedback is helpful for you. We'll take the opposite leg in. I'm going to hold just lightly behind my knee, and I'm going to put my finger on my sits bone because I like that feedback. That's helpful for me. And then I'm going to try to keep the sits bone released. Keep it from pulling up towards the ceiling. I'm going to think of the tailbone relaxed. I'm going to hit the first moment of tightness and stop. Just a little awareness of tension. And then maybe a tiny bit more, thinking of the hamstring fibers letting go, maybe like the hamstring yawns a little bit, like that feeling. Then I get like half an inch straighter. And then release all that, start the whole thing over. Float it up, first point of tension, pause. Easy tailbone, easy sits bones. Relaxed pelvic floor. Maybe a little straighter. Let it all go, reset it. A couple more like that. And the next time you go up, we're going to hold it up there a little longer. That little bit of tone in your abdominals. You can take your hands away if you want to try that. Easy hamstring, easy sits bones, easy tailbone. A little bit of abdominal tone. And then take it down. Both legs down. Comparison. What do you notice? For me, now both legs have all those feelings I described on the other side. Everything let go a little bit more. And then bring yourself up to sitting. Okay, so hopefully some of that's starting to work for you. So let's see what it's like now to let the spine move a little bit. That's another part of forward bending. One part of forward bending is the hamstrings have to let go. Another part of forward bending is the bend, is the spine. So let's do a little bit with the spine. So we'll start, knees a little bent, maybe up on your sits bones to start a little bit, and then tip your weight back so you get all the way behind your tailbone. For some people, the tailbone's really tender, and especially if that's the case for you, you want to get way back behind so you're not propped on that tender tailbone. So I'm kind of curled under, and if you remember last week, we talked about the sits bones being kind of drawn together sometimes and spread apart other times. This would be a time where you might draw the sits bones together, but for our purposes today, we're just going to stay with that feeling of sits bones kind of relaxed, not really trying to go one way or another, just kind of a neutral feeling. And then really letting the tailbone, like the tailbone glides under. Yeah. And letting your knees bend here, holding on either at the backs of your legs or your knees. Now take a breath into your back. Exhale. Hollowing out your belly, letting your back open a little bit. And then let's take your left leg straight out on the floor and hold the back of your right, behind your right knee. And we're going to start this one-legged roll down and up, tipping a little backwards and working your way down to your back. We're kind of in the position we were a moment ago. So take a moment, relax your sits bone, relax your tailbone. Inhale, lift your head and look into your belly. Press your leg a little forward. Now, don't tuck your tailbone. Don't lift your pelvis. See if you can just leave the pelvis out of it. Push your leg. Round your spine. Lever yourself up. Taking that same thing again. Little behind your tailbone. No extra effort around the sits bones. A little bit of tone in your belly. Probably your hamstring is on a little bit, but it's not. You're just kind of pushing the leg forward, and whatever comes on is fine. You don't have to do extra tightening there. Coming back up, inhale. Notice it here. Exhale. Press the leg without lifting your pelvis. To come back up one more time. And all the way back up. Okay, switch legs, see what that's like. Now, maybe what you're noticing is you do create a lot of tension down there. Sometimes the other leg's popping up. Sometimes there's a lot of tightening. It's hard to get up. So, of course, you can always just do halfway down and up. Play with the range of motion that allows you to work with this image. Doesn't have to go all the way down and back up. That's always true. You can always play with that. So back behind your tailbone, easy sits bones, round spine, a little bit of tone in your belly. Start the tip backwards. A little bit of resistance in that left leg. It's pushing forward a little, but it's not coming from your sits bone. Take a moment at the bottom. Start your way back up again. Especially as you start that transition, that's where everything wants to tighten in the pelvic floor. Breathe through it. And 2 more times. And then finishing sitting here. So what are you noticing? I feel like that's the question a lot when we do pelvic floor work. It's not do this, feel this, try this. It's more, what did you notice? What did you notice? What did you notice? Because there's so many ways things just happen automatically. And some of what we're doing here is just trying to bring those automatic tendencies into awareness. And then from there, play little like tiny volume knob shifts, right? Like not even from 8 to 9, like from 8 to 8.25 or something, right? Just little bitty changes there. I think for a lot of people in that exercise right there, it becomes very obvious how this moment right here, like everything wants to grab to lift you. So many people feel that just lifting and tightening through the hamstring, through the sits bones, through the pelvis, everything. It's really hard to get that to let go. So the first thing is just to notice it. And then to work slowly over time to do a little less, a little less, a little less. So sometimes when we start to notice tension, it's like, oh, it's on, and I need to turn it off. And then we just get frustrated because we can't go straight from on to off, right? But we can dim it a little bit. And maybe you're working that way to play with it. So let's try coming onto your hands and feet and into a little bit of a forward bend here. Just notice what that feels like. Knees a little bent, sits bones broad, tailbone released, and really letting the spine release and fold here. And then feeling the feet really grounded. For me, when I get the sits bones to release, my heels feel a little heavier. When I get the tailbone to release, my spine feels a little more relaxed. And then starting to come up, knees bend and sits bones sink, tailbone sinks. And just unrolling the spine all the way back to standing. Okay, I'm going to pass the AirPod and head over to the tall guy. I think I surprised him.
Hey, everybody. So before we continue, something I just can't resist is to have these two guys facing the same way. That was really important right there. So let's continue the discussion. Step your feet wide apart and turn both your legs a little bit out. Sumo squat. Exhale, bend. Ankles, hips, and knees. and then inhale, come up. Now, one of the most important movements here is actually the flexion in the hips. Now, that's easily overdone. Sometimes people bend their knees and end up with their torso horizontal, and that's too much. And there is an exercise where the torso stays straight up and down. That's something entirely different. So what we're looking to do here is to harmonize the degree to which the ankles bend, the hips bend, the degree to which the knees bend, the hips bend. And inhale up. So let's do a few of those movements and see if you can find a relationship or a harmony in the contribution of the three joints of your lower extremities. Ankles, knees, hips. Now, as we continue making this movement, whether or not you feel your pelvic floor, when you have this harmonization, I'm not sure if that's a word, but I'll persist with it. When you have this harmonization of these three major joints of your lower extremities, your pelvic floor muscles are involved in a healthy way. So that's one reason I do the sumo in almost every class that I teach, to help access the pelvic floor. So next time, knees in that bent position, again, hips and ankles also involved. Let's pause there. Then you could keep hands on the hips or bring them in prayer position, your choice. And now to work the pelvic floor muscles a bit more deeply, take both your heels a couple inches up. And no need to engage your pelvic floor, no need to do anything to or with your pelvic floor. It happens spontaneously. So let's keep your right heel lifted up and slowly over a count of 5, descend that left heel down. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, touch, lift. Both heels again up. Now keep your left heel where it is. Slowly descend your right one down. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Touch, lift. And now both heels slowly descending. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Contact. Let's pause here. Aware of whatever sensations may be arising in your body, whether it's muscles starting to talk to you, maybe bark at you, or the feelings of your feet on the floor. And with that sense awareness of your body, slowly, slowly come up and then step your feet together. So now we're going to make our way to the floor. Exhale. Knit your ribs to your belly. Keep that knit. Inhale, arms up. Exhale, mobilize your spine, fold. We'll pause here, let your head hang just like you did with Collette a few moments ago. And now with the next exhale, stretch the crown of your head forward. We'll pause here for a few breaths. And then step your feet back. Back to yoga pose, head down dog. And with the next exhale, come on down to your knees, all the way down onto the floor and seated. Let's start off knees bent, feet flat upon the floor. And get cozy with your sitting bones. So just like you explored a little bit earlier, so whether there's a little flesh or more flesh or somewhere in between, rock to the backs of your sitting bones. So do you feel how spine flexion occurs naturally? Now from the backs of your sitting bones, rock forward to the front of your sitting bones. And you see how your spine straightens up? Sit up taller. So those are your sitting bones. So a couple breaths here, more on the center or even the front of your sitting bones. And then slowly rock back onto the backs of your sitting bones. Not too far. I know some of you, as Collette mentioned, have tenderness in the tailbone. So from rounded spine or spine flexion, rock from the backs of your sitting bones to the points of your sitting bones, maybe even a little bit forward. And we'll pause here for a few breaths. Now, from the sitting to hands and knees. From hands and knees to head down dog. So maybe you're wondering, what was the point to that whole thing we just did right there in sitting? Maybe he lost his train of thought. Maybe he was trying to kill time until some idea came into his head. Those things sometimes happen when I teach, okay, no doubt. But it was intentional, this time anyway. Now in head down dog, those two sitting bones, invite the front edges of your sitting bones to slide apart. And I don't know about you, but I just felt my hamstrings release. And that's one of the qualities, that's one of the properties as the pelvic floor tension dissipates, just like Collette mentioned at the outset, helps to free up the hamstrings. And here's a way to put it into practice and take it from theory into practice. And exhale, gorilla. Inhale, full. Exhale, roll up. Inhale, arms down. All right, let's revisit the sumo. Step your feet wide apart. From your hip sockets, turn both legs out. So remember those sitting bones, especially the center or even toward the front edge of your sitting bones. So power of your mind as you exhale. Let the fronts of your sitting bones slide apart and let that initiate the triple flexion. Then as you inhale, gently draw your sitting bones together and let that initiate the coming up. Exhale, sitting bones release apart. Inhale, sitting bones draw together. So imagine that your legs are not making these movements. They're not generating the power. That the movement originates from your sitting bones. Now let's take that imagery one step further. Imagine that it's the breath that is moving the sitting bones. They inhale together. They exhale apart. Now let's do a couple more. So I sometimes like to think of the pelvic floor as the core of the core. And then step your feet together. Short story. I was taking a training with a world famous skiing coach. And that coach, even at a relatively advanced age, could outski everybody, the professionals included. And he did a demonstration, and he asked all of us, who were very experienced skiers, what did I do there to make this beautiful, graceful series of turns down the hill? And after a lot of incorrect answers, the answer was he initiated the turns from his pelvic floor. And it was noticeable. We could all see the result, even if we couldn't see how exactly he did it. So these muscles down here are really key for the health and the vitality of the human body. So let's make our way to the floor again. Exhale, knit your ribs. Keep that connection. Inhale up. Exhale, fold. Inhale, gorilla. And exhale, step back. So let's take a few breaths here. Remember how last time we were here I talked about what facilitates going deeper into head down dog. Even though it may feel like the hamstrings, is so often in the pelvic floor. Imagine your sitting bones are free to slide away from each other. And then use your exhale to facilitate the releasing of the sitting bones away from each other, apart. A few more breaths here. And then come on down. So all the way down into seated. And this time with your feet out in front of you. So in a moment, you can maybe predict, you can see where this is headed. We're going to fold forward. As you do so, imagine your sitting bones release apart. Now, the sticky mat, they aren't all that free to slide, truth be told. Imagine that they slide apart as you fold forward. Hands maybe come to your knees or your shins, maybe even to your feet. Let me take a few more breaths here. And then roll back up. All right. So next time through, we're going to use the breath to support the movement. So each exhale over successive exhales, sitting bones apart, facilitating folding forward. So during the inhale, we'll pause, exhale, fold forward. And that may take 3, 4, 5 breaths. So next exhale, sitting bones apart, come a little bit forward. Pause there for the inhale. Exhale, sitting bones slide apart, a little bit more forward. Pause there for the inhale. Maybe it's a fraction of an inch. Exhale, sitting bones apart, and maybe it's just incrementally folding forward. So next couple of breaths silently on your own, folding forward with the out breath. Then come on up. And now join your soles together, which can sound deeply ontological, but in this case is purely physical. Join the soles of your feet together. Hands could either be catching your feet or they could be behind you. Either way to prevent toppling over backwards. In our household here, you never know, there may be a cat behind you. You don't want to smush one of your cats. So as you let your knees move away from each other, more than trying to get your knees to the floor, let your sitting bones initiate that movement. Sitting bones release away from each other. Right, because tightness here, where your knees are way up high, has a component of pelvic floor. And so we're using the exhale to sitting bones apart. Exhale, sitting bones apart. If even just something that you're imagining, even if you don't feel anything. Then come on up. Take your legs forward. Now, you can probably see this one coming. We're going to take those two movements and merge them. Bring your right leg in, so your mirror image of me. Each exhale, let your sitting bones slide away from each other to facilitate folding forward. Then come on back up, both feet forward. Those of you with osteopenia or osteoporosis, it's okay to fold a little bit forward, just not a whole heck of a lot. Second side, left foot in. Now, whether you're working with bone density or not, this work with the sitting bones and folding from your hips, perfectly okay. If you have some bone density issues, you don't want to round your spine a whole heck of a lot, but it's okay to round your spine just a little bit. So let the breathing move your pelvic bones. And let those movements of your pelvic bones facilitate the folding forward. And come on back up. And both feet forward. I remember the first time I really felt that in my body. It was a eureka moment. That I'd heard it and I knew the theory, but I didn't really feel it. And like literally one day, the switch was flipped and I could feel it and really enjoyed a lot more freedom in my body. All right, so let's continue this thread. So keeping both legs forward, sitting bones release apart so you sit more upright. And then let's take right leg in. Bring your left arm across, give that leg a hug. If you're working with bone density issues, turn just a little bit, not too much. If bone density is not for you an issue, you can rotate a little bit further. And steady breathing. So you might be wondering, okay, how do I work with the pelvic floor in these twists right here? Not quite as directly as what we did previously. Mainly in terms of sitting upright and going from the backs of your sitting bones more toward the fronts of your sitting bones by letting them slide away from each other. And back to the middle, both feet forward, and then bend your left knee. Now, I don't know about you, but I found that just bending that knee, I kind of was kicked back onto the back of my sitting bones toward tailbone land. So everything we've been discussing, I know it's been maybe a little repetitive, but it's that important. Twist to the other side. Right arm comes across, left hand behind. Steady breathing. And back in toward the middle. Transitioning to hands and knees. From hands and knees to yoga pose, head down dog. We'll spend about a minute here. So we've been talking quite a bit about pelvic floor and sitting bones and their relationship to hip flexion. and exploring how, if at all, those ideas apply in your body. And then come on down. And then set up in sitting. So I'm going to sit up on a cushion. You may choose to set up sitting in a chair. Or maybe you're a minimalist and you're just going to sit directly on the floor. So whatever choice that you make, of course, sitting involves the core. But sitting also involves the core of the core to the pelvic floor. And there's a paradox that occurs. Muscles that are weak tend to be tight. Muscles that are tight tend to be weak. So the tight pelvic floor makes it really hard to sit upright. So doing things like sumo, like warrior, to help tone the pelvic floor, supports releasing the tension in the pelvic floor, supports sitting upright. For most of us, sitting is about gently rocking from the backs of the sitting bones more toward the center point. You'll know you're on the right track with that when you naturally, organically sit taller. And now let's do some deep breathing. Get some more freedom in that rib cage. Exhale, connect your lower ribs to your belly. Keep that connection. Inhale, fill your lungs. Exhale, reassert the connection of lower ribs to belly. Nurture that connection. Fill your lungs. Fill both your lungs. Quite often one lung is dominant. Fill both of them up. Fill all of your lungs. Many people are over-reliant on the front lower lungs. Fill all the rest of your lungs up. Next few deep breaths on your own. Now let go of the deep breathing. All right. So before we close for the morning here, any comments, questions in the chat? Looks like it's kind of quiet out there. Well, again, thank you so much for the requests. We had some great requests come in to work with the pelvic floor, also requests to work with folding forward, to work with some of the twists, and later on we'll work with some of the inversions, the upside down position. So thank you for your requests. Keep them coming, and have a great evening, morning, afternoon, whenever you're watching this. Embody and enjoy. Bye-bye.